Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll be discussing the state-sponsored investigation, finding that a whistleblower alleging retaliation for not towing the line on the effects of the carbon auction had no merit. One Washington county that's actually seeing a decrease in homelessness. The city of Spokane officials preparing to scale back spending after the COVID-19 aid has dried up, and more. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation is bringing you straight news journalism through the Center Square, reporting on state authorities and publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. By supporting the Center Square, you can track politicians' use of taxpayer money and demand transparency from elected officials. This is how we can equip everyday Americans to hold their government accountable. Become a supporter of Franklin today at franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now, let's jump into the headlines. The political messaging behind Washington's carbon auction reached a fever pitch last year before its enactment. Governor Jay Inslee is famously quoted saying the auctions selling carbon emission allowances would cost just pennies at the pump. Commuters found out the effect of the auction was up to 50 cents per gallon higher at the pump in all reality. Amid the stump speeches, a state employee stood up and refused to give the likely bogus statistic echoed by auction supporters. Washington editor Brett Davis has a new development in this story. Brett?
So an investigation by the Seattle-based law firm of Ogden Murphy Wallace on behalf of the Washington State Department of Transportation, they found no merit to most of former WSDOT economist Scott Smith's claims that he was pressured to lie about the impact of the Climate Commitment Act on gas prices and forced out of his job because of it. Smith said he was punished for not going along with fudging the numbers, including being refused basic software upgrades at his job, being denied time off to visit his elderly mother, and actually having his job eliminated through House Bill 1838, which the legislature passed last year. Smith quit his job in early November, basically saying he was forced out. In March, Smith filed a lawsuit in Thurston County Superior Court against WSDOT, the Office of Financial Management, and the administration of Governor Jay Inslee. The law firm's 91-page report basically says Smith's perceptions of events were, and this is a quote from them, are significantly different in many respects from the descriptions of events provided by the witnesses who were interviewed. Quote, therefore, no violations of the applicable policies were substantiated based on the information reviewed for this investigation. So basically, they found there was no merit to his claims.
So you're saying a law firm hired by the accused state agency found said state agency didn't do anything improper by pushing out a man who refused to admit the carbon auctions would lead to some of the nation's highest gas prices. And he was right, among others who had predicted the same thing. They're saying that there's no, has there been any questions of bias by the law firm because they're being paid by the accused state agency? Right.
Well, the law firm, they said a preponderance of evidence that that he misunderstood his supervisor's request on January 18th, 2023, not to change forecast assumptions in his quarterly fuel tax revenue forecast. The report goes on to say that, changes to the forecast assumptions are not typically unilaterally made by one forecaster, and that the Office of Financial Management carries out its forecast responsibilities for, transportation revenues through the Transportation Revenue Forecast Council. So basically, they're saying it wasn't all up to him, that he was just one of many. He was part of the process. So that's sort of how they dismissed his claims, essentially.
But they're saying Smith, but that's not what Smith is alleging, right? He's not saying that I was the one voice who was supposed to predict how much these prices would go up. He says that I was among many people who were supposed to predict this. I wouldn't say that this would only be pennies, that the carbon auction would only result in just a few cents of increased gas prices. And that's when the retaliation set in. And he's got concrete examples of what appear to be, by any other HR standard, to be retaliation. And they're still saying that, well, it was a misunderstanding. It just seems very odd to me. But this doesn't change the lawsuit Smith has filed with the help of the Citizen Action Defense Fund, correct?
That's right. So while the internal investigation is over, Smith's lawsuit, it continues in Thurston County Superior Court. Now, Jackson Maynard, he's the executive director of the Citizen Action Defense Fund and Smith's lawyer. He said, of course, he was disappointed and strongly disagreed with the report's conclusions. But he said he thinks the discovery process will vindicate Smith's claims in the long run. So this is an ongoing story, and we'll see more developments on this in the future.
That we will. Thank you, Brett. Moving on, the big news of the homelessness front this month has been that King County revealed that despite hundreds of millions of dollars spent by the cities funneled up to the Regional Homeless Authority, that they counted far more people living on the streets or in shelters than they had ever seen before. However, King County's northern neighbor is seeing homelessness on the decline. Seattle reporter Spencer Pauly had this story. Spencer, how much of a decline is Snohomish County seeing?
Well, Snohomish County had a near 10% decrease in homelessness this year. Last year, the county tallied about 1,285 unhoused people on a single night in January, which was an all-time high for the region. This year found 1,161 unhoused people, which makes up about 1% of the county's population of 800-some thousand people.
Take a step back for people that might not be familiar with what a point-in-time count is, and it's called the PIT. Describe the process behind how this is, one, a federally mandated program count, but also describe how it works and what they actually do to ascertain how many people are, one, living on the streets, and two, in shelters.
Point-in-time count, as you said, is a federally required count of homelessness across the United States. You'll have counties and cities gather up volunteers who will go out on a single night in January and count how many people are living within shelters or are out on the streets. It's important to note that many governmental entities acknowledge that statistics are most likely an undercount since the homeless population is so mobile, but this is what the Housing and Urban Development Department wants to do, just to kind of get a gauge in the sense of the scale of homelessness across the United States.
And one thing that always has struck me as questionable is what you're doing is you're taking account of people that are living on the streets, but you're doing it in January. You know, I've visited Seattle on many occasions, and Seattle in January is not a time when somebody would find living on the street a hospitable situation. And I always felt like it was a flawed statistic. I mean, it would be akin to measuring how many people were living on the street in Phoenix, for instance, in the middle of summer when it's 118 degrees outside. So that always made me question it. But that also kind of goes to your thought of saying that the PIT is almost always assumed to be a lowball estimate of how many people are actually on the street, correct?
Correct, yes. And back to what you said about why they do the count in January, I think that's the best way to get the accurate depiction of who's actually struggling to find shelter and housing. If you're living out in streets in January, that means you're not going camping per se, or living in an encampment on a campus to protest something.
Now, did the Snohomish County give any reasoning behind what they're seeing as a reduction in homelessness when most other counties around them, major metros, especially King County, is seeing record numbers?
Right. Well, in a statement, Snohomish County Executive Dave Somers said, the county's recent investments to address the homelessness crisis have worked. They haven't done anything much different than you're seeing in King County. This includes, increasing affordable housing and expanding behavioral health services. I believe last year, the county spent over $30 million on these initiatives. And a lot of funds used to combat homelessness come from the American Rescue Plan Act. This is what the county has used to combat these issues. Exact statistics for how much the county is putting towards homelessness are kind of difficult to find since the work spreads across so many different departments within the county. But I can assure you the county spending is much less than, for instance, the $104.7 million the city of Seattle is spending to KCRHA to address this issue. I think what you're seeing here is just the scale of homelessness compared to King County. Snohomish County is smaller than King County. So therefore, I think we're just seeing money going directly to the caught needs of homeless people.
Yeah, like you said, the reduction represents, it's 124 people is the total difference between last year's PIT and this year's PIT.
Right.
Because they've got so many fewer homeless people in King County, for instance, or Los Angeles County or San Francisco County, where, you're measuring them in the thousands, compared to, Snohomish County, where it's like 1,100.
It's a whole different scale. It's a whole different scale.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if you were to look at that in terms of it, like you said, you can't narrowed down how much they're spending per homeless person to get them off the street, because they seem to lump in everything to like human services, because it's not such a massive problem like with King County that they need their own major departments, KCRHA, and their own programs, that they can simply just do this through Health and Human Services.
Right. But that Human Services department within Snohomish County, for instance, has over about $78 million dedicated to the department this year. I mean, that's not a small chunk of change, you know?
Yeah.
But
that's not a small number. Yeah, you're correct. But thank you, Spencer. This is an interesting story, and we'll definitely look at keep an eye on this as we move into the summer months. After pulling her proposed levy that would have closed a budget gap without having to make any major reductions, Spokane Mayor Lisa Brown is asking city departments to prepare for some lean days. Eastern Washington reporter Tim Klauser covered this announcement. How deep would these planned cuts get, Tim, and how is she going about planning the reductions?
Yeah, Cole. So Mayor Lisa Brown is taking an approach that she's familiar with from her time working with the state government and Department of Commerce, and going about the $50 million budget deficit with a 2-budget book scenario. Essentially provides 2 different options for the budget, sort of a outlook on the models. One would match ongoing expenditures to existing revenue sources, eliminating the use of one-time funds for ongoing expenses, which has been the ongoing problem the last few years. And that other model looks at how Lisa Brown's strategy would have fared. And that includes her levy that you had mentioned previously that she pulled from the August ballot. She did mention, though, the other day that first book scenario would include a 10% cut across each city department. She said this isn't what the city is advocating for, but it's a possibility they're looking at. So it's not concrete yet, but if we are to go with that first book scenario where we're cutting out all these reoccurring expenditures using one-time funds, it's likely that we'll see a lot of personnel cuts across the city, much like Lisa Brown said would happen if her levy didn't pass in the first place. I'm not sure if you remember, but when she initially proposed the levy, she said around 200 people from the city could wind up losing their jobs as the result of the levy failing, significantly impacting public safety within the city. A lot of those cuts would have been police officers and firefighters and people working in City Hall.
Hearing you say that, even after I'd read and gone through the story, that sounds what catches my eye is that the scenario 2 assumes that this levy is in place, and she pulled it. That got canceled out. They're not going to run that this fall. Is there even a scenario where that tax gets implemented by the time they have to enact the next budget? Or is it, just kind of a hypothetical where the budget scenario 1 with the reductions and the streamlining of government by just via lack of funds, how is that not going to be what happens there?
It looks like they're going to remain in this hole for 2024. They do have a chance to pass that levy still, but it won't be until the next special election after August, which would be November. So that would, if assuming that it passed, would get that revenue generating for the 2025 year so they can start picking up the pieces. But right now they're kind of just sitting in that hole. Like you said, the levy hasn't passed and we don't know if it will even pass. But it's all a bit interesting to assume 2 different models, one model looking at extreme cuts, and the other model being just having that levy that she initially proposed that would have anticipated cuts if it didn't pass anyway. So there's still a lot of movement that's going to come here. The meeting that they had with Matt Boston, the city CFO, was one of 3 that's going to take place. I believe they're going to look at these scenarios and then return to city council for future input in the next month. But right now, this is what we're looking at.
The mayor's budget director you mentioned, who after looking into it, he was the former city council budget director that they had hired on. It was like a new position so that they could kind of keep up with the mayor's budget director, so they could, I guess, I don't know exactly what the relationship there was, but then he was hired on to Lisa Brown's office once the transition took place and the old budget director under the former mayor was told to resign. He seemed pretty quick to lay the blame at the feet of former Mayor Woodward for approving what largely he said was a police contract using COVID-19 aid.
Yeah, so this has been the running theme with the new administration since Lisa Brown took over and even beforehand, where they're looking at former Mayor Nadine Woodward's spending habits during COVID as the root cause of this deficit. All those reoccurring expenditures using one-time funds, like you mentioned, the police overtime contract, that retroactive pay, they're all sort of shifting blame.
Well, it's not our fault we're in this. It's definitely the person that was here before, so we can, make sure that we're going to be the ones that fix it without getting any of the blame. Essentially, is what I'm hearing. But it's funny because now the levy proposal is saying that this will go to pay for approving a police contract, or will go to pay for the approved police contract. They've said, too, that a budget is very fungible. And, the money that would have gone to approve the police contract, it increased the size of the budget. So they relied on the one-time COVID-19 aid. Mm-hmm. But then again, at the same time, you have a situation where that money can be shifted around. And former Mayor Woodward said, our priority is public safety. Getting a police contract approved after the Spokane Police Department officers had not gotten a raise in a number of years was a priority. And it just seems a little interesting that, if Lisa Brown was in that same position, would she have not approved a police contract when everybody at the time was very, very interested in public safety? It just seems like something that caught my ear when they're trying to lay the blame for the police contract and not reducing other spending on things that they possibly could have had more flexibility in. In terms of that, the levy to fill the budget hole, that's canceled. Now you're saying it's a possibility that could be for November. In terms of the timeline, if that does get enacted in November, say ideal situation for the Brown administration, will that money then come in midway through this coming budget?
I'm not quite sure there, Cole. I just know they're trying to fill the hole in their general fund. I think it's important to note that Spokane has an annual budget of around $1.2 billion. And that comes from 7 different funds. And the most flexible out of all those funds is the city's general fund, which supports basic city functions like City Hall, police department, and the fire department, which is where we're seeing a lot of this deficit. So Boston mentioned in that meeting, as much as the city would like to just pull funding from another fund and fill this hole, it's not that simple. And that's what Lisa Brown's levy would have done. It would have essentially taken all this revenue and put it into the general fund to fill that hole and also provide enhancements she talked about. But the priority would have been filling those holes. While a lot of enhancements were proposed for police, fire, and other programs, essentially as that money came in, it would have gone to fill the holes first and then provide those enhancements after.
It's always revealing how inflexible the money is when they have to try and use it to shift around to fill a budget hole, but how flexible that money becomes when a public safety levy then decidedly gets shifted over to fill the said budget hole. Appreciate it, Tim. Washington's ferries have seen issues since before the pandemic, but COVID-19 seemed to only make things worse. A recent survey conducted by the agency that manages the boats says customers are not only unhappy, but choosing other modes of transportation altogether. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson had this story. What seemed to be the major point of contention, Carlene?
Yeah, Cole, I think it's important to frame this discussion first, because for those of us who don't rely on the ferry service for, getting to work, getting to doctor's appointments, whatever, we can just not pay attention to all the complaints from the poor ferry riders. But Washington State Ferry Service is the largest ferry system in the United States, and it's the second largest vehicular ferry system in the entire world, just behind British Columbia ferries. So they carried 18.66 million riders last year. That was about half and half between passengers and people in vehicles. So all those poor people paying to drive across the Puget Sound, right? It's a transportation system run by DOT. They deserve for us to pay some attention. So I'll get off my soapbox now, but
no, that's a good point. It's valid. Some people rely on this, right? I mean, these aren't just tourists looking to do some sightseeing. You have people that live on these islands and need to commute in for work. And it sounds like the major issue is unreliability.
Unreliability. And I mean, the problems go back many years before COVID, but then the pandemic hit and you had state ferry workers initially like just not coming to work. And so people couldn't ride the boats. I mean, and then we had the vaccine requirement, the COVID vaccine requirement, and the ferry service lost close to 140 employees, which might not seem like a lot, but when some of those are the guys that drive the boats, the workers that do the maintenance, the ticket takers, you know, when you're buying your ticket, or they're checking to make sure you've got your pass before you board. Without those critical personnel, the system has been crippled and they have yet to recover. There's
not a lot of redundancies that come with something like ferry operation or, you know, you look at things like the airlines. It's also the reason why they can't strike. I mean, they have like an arbitration system that requires them to go through instead of actually just walking off the job, because like you said, it would cripple the infrastructure that these people rely on every day to get to work.
100%. And let's just remember, it's not cheap. I just checked what they're paying right now. So driver and vehicle of an average length of 14.7 feet, according to a quick Google search, that single driver getting on the Seattle Bainbridge run today is going to pay $22.50 to cross the Puget Sound. So when you're going to fork that out, you'd like to know that the boat's going to be there pretty much on time, that there's going to be a boat, right? It's the poor people, Cole, on what they call the triangle route, the Fauntleroy, Vashon, Southworth, that have been the most, pardon the term, it's kind of crude, but they've been screwed. I mean, they went down, they've been on a 2-boat schedule that was implemented during the pandemic when it was the worst of the worst. They're like, okay, let's put them from a 3-boat down to a 2-boat schedule for the next 24 hours. Well, that was almost 3 years ago. And they're still operating on a 2-boat schedule. And oftentimes one of those boats is out for maintenance issues or crew issues. So those people running on that triangle route down often to 1 boat, 70% of them in this rider survey said we are extremely dissatisfied with ferry service. And obviously. Yeah,
they're trying to get to work. And when you've got one ferry and everyone's trying to cram onto that, there's a situation for a lot of these folks that just, sorry, there's no more space for cars. Sorry, you're not going to be able to make it to work.
The assistant secretary for Washington State Ferries, John Vizina, in this, report to the Transportation Commission,
he's really candid.
Wow, he really was. He said, I'll read you this one quote. He said, honestly, I'd like to find the 3 people on Vashon Island who said our service is satisfactory. I'd like to give them a hug because it's tough there. So basically conceding the fact that, if anybody on Vashon said they were happy with ferry service, he was shocked. But at the same time, they are kind of played with some of the figures, and that's my editorial there, played with the figures, but they said that they now have a reliability rate so far this year of 98.7%. Their definition of reliability as a percentage of scheduled trips that depart within an undefined time frame. So let's say, for instance, the boat was supposed to, leave the dock at noon and it didn't leave until 3. They still consider that a reliable trip.
Well, thank you, Carlene, for opening our eyes to the ferry situation that a lot of these folks have to deal with. And a big thank you to our journalists for sharing their stories as well. Stay up to date on these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach, and until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.